So today, Chris and I are going to talk about some research we've been working on over the last few years. And as everybody here knows, research does not exist in a vacuum. So in addition to Chris and I working on this project, we've also been collaborating with two of our colleagues, Dr. Dominic Atkinson and Dr. Adele Quigley McBride. So I'd like to thank them for their efforts on the projects we're talking about. So, Chris, first slide, thanks. So we all know from tracking the news over the last few years that there have been some new challenges to public safety. There have been some new challenges presented to how law enforcement and aviation security need to police us and keep us safe and monitor and surveil. So for example, the Boston Marathon in, I believe that was 2013 in the US, and the sarin gas attacks in the UK back in the early 2000s, I think. So there's some bad actors out there who are creating challenges for how we're going to understand how people are moving through public spaces and what their goals might be. So in security, human observation is a primary way of tracking people's movements. However, if we look at some of the interventions and strategies that law enforcement has come up with, both on the aviation side and just the local PDs and federal agencies, they're throwing technological solutions at it. So if you go into airports, there's the body scanners, we have X-ray machines, there's sniffers that are looking for a signal that there might be explosive material available. And while these technological solutions are helpful, they're not the be all and end all. And so there might be some more effective ways to track people's movements and understand something about what they're doing. So with human observation in mind as this primary method used by security personnel, we're posing the questions of, can security personnel identify individuals who are concealing? And we're posing this question in the context of just based on people's movements, just based on people's nonverbal communication, nonverbal behavior. So in the absence of these technological solutions. And then are there certain nonverbal behaviors that might in fact be diagnostic of concealment? So, Chris. So law enforcement does receive training. There's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, that put out a training called Characteristics of an Unarmed Gunman. And this has been the foundation of training that law enforcement has received. And then there was a research report put out by the Naval Research Lab in the US that built on the characteristics of an armed gunman. But I want to point out that the research or the behaviors they're identifying, they're not evidence-based. This is subject matter experts, right? So a law enforcement officer, here's what I think it looks like when somebody is concealing a firearm or concealing a prohibited item. So I just want to bring up, there's a counterfactual in behavioral research where there's an alternate explanation for a behavior you're observing. So for example, if you look at the image underneath the NRL report, that blading stance. So officers report people will blade or turn away when they're concealing a firearm. Well, the issue is hips are a measure of where our attention is. So you can imagine a scenario where a young Black male is approached by a white police officer. This person doesn't want to engage with the cop. So what is this young person going to do? He's going to blade, he's going to turn away. And so behaviorally, what that's signaling is my attention is somewhere else. It doesn't necessarily mean that he's concealing a prohibited item. If your clothing is hanging down, a weighted pocket, well, you could have a cell phone, keys, a bottle of water. If you're holding or touching, doing the target touch, well, again, you could be securing an expensive item like a cell phone. So again, I want to point out that none of this has been grounded in any kind of systematic research. There's no evidence that these behaviors systematically and reliably suggest concealment of a prohibited item. So next slide, Chris, please. So in the United States, we have this notion of stop and frisk that's predicated by a decision back in the late 60s, Terry v. Ohio, where officers must have reasonable suspicion about whether or not somebody is concealing something, whether somebody is about to or has committed a serious offense. Now, the challenge for officers is that they are expected to point to very specific behaviors. They need to clearly articulate what they're observing, what the behaviors were, in order to initiate this stop and search or this stop. Now, I believe there's similar laws in the UK and New Zealand. Now, interestingly, in a decision back in 2000 in Illinois v. Wardlow, Chief Justice Rehnquist, he actually said courts do not have empirical studies dealing with these inferences. Now, remember, the training the law enforcement officers are getting is based in anecdote. It's not evidence-based. So the courts are basically saying with this decision 21 years ago, give us evidence to support what these officers are saying. But now the way the system is set up, the courts are tending to side with the officers so that the officers aren't completely hamstrung when they're out doing their job. Chris?
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks so much, Dawn. And so we had two key research questions. One, can officers reliably detect the concealment of a weapon or object when compared with naive controls? And what subjective or objective behavioral patterns might prove diagnostic of concealment? One thing I want to do is separate the line of research that we've done from other lines of research that are out there. So for example, we're not interested in the question of can officers identify a weapon when it's present in the environment. There's a string of studies on shoot, no shoot that look at weapon detection in that context and distinguishing it from other objects. We're also not necessarily interested in malintent or predicting violence or predicting threat. Here, we're looking at a basic detection task where the deceptive act is one of simple concealment. The intent is to conceal, not to necessarily cause harm. So that kind of distinguishes it from other lines of research. And today, I want to just briefly, because we don't have much time, talk about 3 studies that we've done in this context. One in which we asked participants to conceal a Glock 9mm, another in which participants concealed a 2-quart bucket of water that was open, and they had to carry that, in a backpack. And then a third in which we asked participants to conceal a handkerchief. Now, think about these objects for a moment. Certainly that 2-quart bucket of water, open bucket of water in a backpack is going to be likely the more difficult thing to conceal, right? There's weight to the water, it's sloshing around in the back, and your objective is not to lose any water, but also to conceal the fact that you're carrying it. That's likely the most difficult task here. Glock 9mm are weighty. Most of our participants had not carried a firearm before, and we worked with local law enforcement to neuter the firearm in that context. And then, of course, the concealed red handkerchief is likely the easiest to conceal, right? It's not very much weight. And so you might imagine that we'd see some differential patterns of detection across these. Now, the objective of participants here was to identify who was concealing versus not concealing these items. So across our studies, we had on average about 50 officers and between 55 and 70 naive controls. And we looked at signal detection measures of D prime and response bias. And just so we're all on the same page, D prime can vary negatively and positively. Positive values above 0 are above chance detection. And the higher the values positive, the better the performance. And I'll give you some kind of corollaries for accuracy rates. So here's what we saw in terms of gun detection. Here our controls actually slightly outperformed our officers, though not significantly. You can see the effect size to the right, but you can see overall detection was quite poor. How about the bucket? Oh, and by the way, the officers were not above chance. They didn't differ from chance performance, but the controls did. How about the bucket of water? Well, a little bit better detection rates, right? About a half a standard deviation above chance performance in signal detection terms, and no difference here between officers and controls. And what about the handkerchief? Again, now we're seeing a larger difference between officers and controls, though not significant, but it's there. And again, here officers were no better than chance. Meta-analytically, we see this kind of benefit in performance to controls over officers. and it translates to about a 5% accuracy rate difference. Though not significant, officers were being outperformed by controls. How about response bias? Just so we're all on the same page here, positive response bias means that you're more likely to have a conservative criterion. A negative response bias here is a liberal criterion. So negative response bias would indicate people were more likely to respond conceal. And here's what we see, the pattern across our studies. A pretty conservative bias overall with the gun, a pretty liberal bias with the bucket, and fairly even to conservative with the handkerchief. But overall, the controls are actually more conservative. They're more likely to respond, not conceal. And if you think about this in the context of the deception work that we and others have done, controls have more of a truth bias, right? They're more likely to respond, not conceal, as to conceal or deception. In terms of subjective cues, so just like deception detection experiments, we asked our participants, what behaviors were you paying attention to in this context? What was driving your decision to conceal? We use a lens model approach to use these head, arm, and gait behaviors to predict both their judgments, their subjective judgments of concealment, and ground truth. Solid lines represent significant paths. Dashed lines represent non-significant paths. So if you look at this figure, you might think, wow, these subjective head, arm, and gait behaviors are actually predicting ground truth. That's pretty impressive. And to a certain extent, predicting their concealed judgments. Unfortunately, as we've already told you, concealed judgments and ground truth are not correlated. That is, people didn't perform very well on this task. And in fact, we see some interesting patterns where both with subjective arm and head behaviors, the direction of effects are actually counter to people's beliefs. So our participants believed that fewer head arm atypical behaviors and more atypical arm behaviors are predictive of concealment, but actually they go the opposite way. Only the subjective gait behaviors were consistent. But don't get too excited about this, because just like in the deception literature, these were small effects. The D's translate to 0.1 to 0.26. These are very small effects in being able to predict ground truth. We also objectively coded the videos for different behavioral cues in the same manner that our subjective participants were looking for these. Our coders were blind to concealment, of course. And you can see by the pattern here of non-significance that largely these head, arm, and gait behaviors that were coded objectively had no relationship to ground truth, and were not very good at all at detecting the concealment judgments either. One more thing is that our objective coding of these behaviors were not correlated with the subjective coding or the subjective assessments of our observers. That's something to maybe talk about a bit more. So in this brief presentation, I hope we've made these points. First, officers showed poor detection performance and were more likely to respond conceal. One thing I didn't tell you is that we also looked at experience and how law enforcement officers' experience correlated with their performance. If anything, it was negatively correlated with detection performance, and greater experience led to them being more likely to respond conceal. So pretty consistent with what we see in the deception literature as well. Subjective behaviors did predict ground truth. However, these were small effects, and they often contradicted what observers believed were diagnostic cues. Objectively coded behaviors, of course, failed to correlate with either our subjective reports and didn't predict concealment either way. And one of the reasons I was really excited about presenting this work with Dawn is that we think there's a lot of room for future research, thinking about context, thinking about extra-legal factors, demographic characteristics of the targets, beliefs of the individual, the context in which a person is looking to see deception. There's so many really interesting factors, and the implications are profound, particularly here in the US, where officers can stop and frisk based on these quote-unquote articulable behaviors. So I'll stop there. Thanks so much for inviting us. We really appreciate it.